Good afternoon, and welcome to another Research in Action brought to you by the Division of Research at Florida Atlantic University. My name is Karen Scapinato. I will be today's moderator. With that, it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Jason Sharples. Dr. Sharples teaches early American history and world civilizations in the Department of History in the Dorothy F. Schmidt College of Arts and Letters at FAU. He has done archival research in Europe, the Caribbean, and around the US, and he has been published in top history journals. He has won research funding from the University of Michigan, the American Philosophical Society, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. He is also the author of a book entitled The World That Fear Made: Slave Revolts and Conspiracy Scares in Early America, which appeared last year. Dr. Sharples received his Ph.D. from Princeton University. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Sharples, who will tell us about the world that fear made. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to thank everyone for coming to hear a little bit about my research as I get my slides shared. So you should be able to see the book cover now. This is, today's talk is about enslaved people's rumors and slaveholders' fears of insurrection in the 17th and 18th century in America. And this is a subject that I've been publishing about for several years and that culminated with this book that appeared last year. So I'm really excited to be able to share this with everyone now. I'm going to be weaving between both mainland North America and the islands of the Caribbean, because in the colonial period, these two regions were integral to one another, politically, economically, and in terms of migration. As a lot of historians have shown, we cannot understand early American slavery in the colonies that became the US unless we also incorporate the Caribbean into our framework, just like the colonists did at the time. They were all part of the same political unit, the same empire. My window onto how enslaved people used rumor and caused fear for white people is through events that today I'll be calling conspiracy scares. Conspiracy scares are events, I'm missing events record great detail in judicial proceedings. They were the product of investigation. These records are kept in archives across the Caribbean, Europe, and the US. And I've gone around and found as many examples of conspiracy scares as I can. So let me explain more about what I mean by a conspiracy scare. This was something entirely different from a rebellion. When I use the word rebellion, I mean collective violence that actually occurred when slaves took up arms against their enslavers. So we're talking about something kinetic that involves actual violence that broke out. A conspiracy scare, on the other hand, was the investigation of a rumor of imminent insurrection. No insurrection actually broke out in the end. Now, that's either because it was never going to, or because the investigation stopped it in the planning stages. For weeks or even months, judges convicted dozens of enslaved men on slim evidence in these investigations and sentenced them to public whipping, to sail out of the area, or to grisly spectacles of execution. Now, historians debate whether these plans were real, whether it was all a figment of the imagination of the investigators or there really was a plan. But my starting point is a little different. My starting point is that what we can be sure of is that the investigation was based on enslaved people's rumor. So it was kind of an exercise of power on their part by kind of feeding these rumors into white society. And it generated a representation of planned violence that the enslavers believed would have occurred, might have occurred. So these conspiracy scares were like a picture into the minds, they're a picture of the fears in the minds of enslavers. They occurred dozens of times in early America in the 17th and 18th centuries. They occurred at least twice as often as slaves actually took up arms in insurrections. These were a window onto people's fears and also how they responded to their fears. This phenomenon shows us that enslaved people were able to manipulate white settlers by playing off that anticipation or the idea that they could revolt. So they're taking the idea that violence was possible from below to manipulate people. So how do we explain fear as scholars? Sure, at a fundamental level, we're talking about enslavers exploiting slaves as being the root cause of their fears of retribution. That makes complete sense, that they knew they were guilty of extreme violence and they expected that it would be coming back to them in return. And real rebellions, although they were fewer in number, made the exaggerations of the conspiracy scares believable. So they were kind of so half the time, or really a third of the time, when violence actually broke out, it made that other 2/3 of the time seem believable. And those other 2/3, by the way, those projections, those fears, were much wilder, much more violent than actual insurrections that broke out. And I'll explain that difference in just a second. So we need to understand how people arrived at the specific fears that I'm about to outline and why they believed them. We also need to understand that they occurred in clusters. So on this map, I'm showing you the places that they occurred. So the flame icons, they're either dark or light, and that shows major scares or minor scares. That's just to give you a sense of how big the event was. But each of these flame icons represents one of these investigations. And then at the bottom, you see a timeline where I've kind of clustered together on the specific years when exactly these occurred. So it gives you a sense of the pacing of these, that sometimes there were a lot, sometimes there were a few. So we can look at these as a whole set to understand what caused them. We can look at their effects because people, whether they were free or enslaved or black or white, they took these fears and they acted on them. They built their lives around them. A great deal of my book explains how slave societies structured themselves around the effects of fear. Now, it's hard to talk about this in an abstract way. I'm going to take a moment to lay out a general framework to understand how this worked in a generalized way before we move on to some concrete examples of people who are collaborating together in jails and in the courtroom to make use of these rumors. So we usually think of fear as an emotional experience, but any experience of fear actually rested on a system of belief too, or a set of assumptions, you might think of them as. How precisely do slaves typically revolt and under which conditions? That's the kind of thinking that people are engaging in. And then that gets triggered into this emotional moment of panic and the response to rumors that lead to investigations. Now, those beliefs, they helped settlers assess threats, or so it seemed, and make predictions about possible danger. These beliefs were also useful for enslaved people because an enslaved person who's conversant in that system of fear, that system of beliefs about what threats could be to white people, can play them against white people through rumors. And that's what was going on in these investigations. So for the rest of my short presentation today, I'll just provide an overview of how that broad set of assumptions was developed through communication between the Caribbean and North America, and how it was possible for individuals, including enslaved people, to navigate their worlds by playing on others' expectations. You can see from these maps that the Caribbean and North America were roughly equivalent in terms of the number of conspiracy scares that went on. So further evidence that we need to actually look at these regions in conversation with each other. All right, so my first example is going to come from New York City. This is the New York City conspiracy scare of 1741. What happened is in the winter of 1741, where's my fire? In the winter of 1741. Okay, well, the New York investigation began as a simple inquiry into a burglary, but the investigation took on much larger dimensions as soon as the authorities questioned a 16-year-old Irish servant girl. She hinted that she knew why the city was having this rash of 13 mysterious fires. When they pressed her, she described a conspiracy that was formed by slaves, as she put it, to burn the fort and the whole town so that when the white people came to extinguish the fires, they would kill and destroy them in an ambush. And so the authorities heard this and mobilized for the defense of the colony. That initial hint led to the coercive investigation that was the conspiracy scare. They arrested many suspects. This is a published list of some of the suspects that they arrested. It goes on for pages in this published account about this incident. They ended up trying in the court 114 slaves. They found each one of them guilty and sentenced them to burn at the stake or be transported out of the colony away from their families, all based on the evidence that those enslaved people gave against each other. Of those guilty slaves, 81 escaped death by agreeing to confess to the conspiracy or name additional suspects. And that's part of how the accusations grew. People were incentivized to save their own life by naming other conspirators, I should say, alleged conspirators. Now, investigators wanted the truth, but they got in their own way. They inadvertently incentivized lying and misremembering. They recruited informants through torture and contrasted this torment with promises of freedom if they would only cooperate. I'm going to give you a sense of just how extreme the coercion was in this torture by talking for a moment about the torture itself, the execution. So I'm going to warn you, there are two images coming up that might be disturbing to you. These are torture devices and scenes of execution. So the first one was a very, very common one that we don't hear about for white people very much, except in the case of piracy. What they did is they put an enslaved person in a cage that looked like this, called a gibbet in the record. And the intent was to hang him up in the public square and have him die slowly of thirst, starvation, and exposure. And in that slow death, the suspect was encouraged to consider saving his life by coming down from the gibbet and in death, they had some very difficult choices to make. They were aware, as one man was heard to lament in jail, that fellows to save their own lives would say anything against him. That's a direct quote from someone overheard in jail. And the executions looked like this. They were public. They were deliberately public, as you can see in these images. Investigators, so in New York, they were burning people at the stake. In many other places, they were hanging them at crossroads, at market squares, all because they wanted to terrify enslaved suspects into cooperating. They believed in gaining compliance through terror and pain in this way. And they saw these public displays of torture and execution as the best way to recruit informants. So, I've taken down the disturbing images of the torture and the execution and replaced it with something that it's an idealized version of enslaved social life in America. We have very few images of enslaved people at all in America. It's either they are, it's a demonstration of what kind of work they were doing, or it would be an idealized vision like this that shows slavery as like a party, or this is a party in this image, or a time when people could gather to try to claim, it's an argument that the engraver is making, that they want to say slavery isn't that bad. But it's really all we have in terms of showing images of enslaved people. But there is a slight truth behind this, and that's that people gathered. I'm not saying they were taken care of or glad to be enslaved or anything, that other messages that are coming from this image, but this image does show that they gathered in groups, and that happened on weekends, on Saturday nights and Sundays. And the handful of informants who broke under torture and agreed to furnish details, well, they didn't give reliable results. We know today that torture doesn't do that. Instead, they thought to these gatherings on the weekends and named distant acquaintances who they saw at the gathering, because a gathering could be construed as a conspiratorial meeting. We know that torture is not reliable today. The only place that torture works is on TV shows. In real life, torture may force people to talk, yes, but it doesn't force people to tell the truth. Instead, it gets them to say something, to say anything that will get the pain to stop, even if they don't have any relevant information. So this is what they turn to, these weekend gatherings. And my research shows that they named people as far away from them socially as they possibly could. So not their family, not their loved ones. They were naming vague acquaintances. Through these forced confessions, a picture of New York's conspiracy emerged in 1741. The decoy fire and the massacre that we already heard about were aimed, they said, at, quote, taking the country and having all the white wives for themselves. The testimony seemed to reveal that they wanted to do this on St. Patrick's Day and that they expected a Spanish invasion, but it never materialized to support them. And they said that they planned all of this over sumptuous feasts at a tavern where they agreed to be captains in the rebellion. And their principal organizers, they said, were a white tavern keeper and a Catholic priest. At these meetings, the white agitators recruited new plotters, in the words of informants, by putting their names down on a paper that was a list of the names of those who were to rise. And the goal for the Blacks was to replace the whites at the head of New York society, according to these coerced confessions. This is the picture of violence that they were painting. It didn't actually happen. And remember, it came out of coerced testimony from torture and other coercions. Now, there are two twists to my presentation. And the first twist is that, as dramatic as this episode was, it was utterly typical of scares in the 18th century. During investigations in different times and places, informants confessed to strikingly similar plans to set diversionary fires and ambush masters who rushed to extinguish them. It was what you might call a trope, or they call a meme on the internet today. It's a kind of a recurring image that people kind of changed slightly for their own local circumstances, but they kept using the same idea. This showed up in scares throughout the colonies, including the relatively famous and well-studied ones, like Gabriel's conspiracy in Virginia in 1800, or maybe you've heard of the Denmark-Vesey conspiracy in Charleston in 1822. And the trope of the decoy fire was just one of many eerie echoes. It seemed like conspirators in general, in all of these examples that I found around the colonies, were allegedly incited and organized by outside agitators, like the Catholic priest in New York City, Catholics being a population that English Protestants were very suspicious of at the time. They promised their support, supposedly, by taking oaths with special drinks, which sounds familiar from New York. They kept names of conspirators in lists, which supposedly circulated but were never found. They often said that the uprising would be timed for a holiday. They coordinated the uprising with an invasion force, like the French, who were Catholic, the Spanish, who were Catholic, or Native Americans, who were a racialized other, another group that was seen as different from the white settlers, and would maybe form an alliance with another group who was deemed to be different from the white settlers, the slaves themselves. That they targeted white women for rape, and finally, above all, that they pined after a social inversion in which they'd adopt the names of leading white men and replace them at the head of families, estates, and government. Literally replace these men in society. These tropes, these fictitious recurring fears appeared in different configurations, but they had coherence for a long time. They could be mixed and matched together, and they often were. So, for example, the specter of sexual violence, of rape, in this image from it's from the Haitian Revolution. It's from later, but because it's an image by someone who wasn't there, they're imagining what this violence would look like, and what do they turn to? The trope of this man chasing this woman. Or we could look at another example of these tropes. This list. This is a list from 1692 that was appended to a report on an alleged conspiracy, in which each conspirator, each enslaved man who was deemed to be a conspirator, was listed on this side, and he was parallel to an actual white elite planter, a slaveholder in Barbados. That's where this is from. These were the names, these are the people whose houses they would take, the names they would take, the families they would take over, allegedly, in this conspiracy. So these, some of these tropes may sound quite outlandish to us, but they recurred and they were believed. So why these roughly consistent confessions? And one possible answer could be that enslaved people were describing exactly what, to them, a revolt should look like. To test that, we can compare what they said about the alleged plans during conspiracy scares to the actions that rebels actually took a third of the time. So remember, 1/3 of this big group of events is actual revolts. 2/3 is conspiracy scare investigations. We look at those kinetic moments, that 1/3 of the time that people actually broke out in revolt, we can see what they actually did. And what they did is they went into inaccessible places. So rebellions almost never resembled this picture of conspiracy. Most revolts were small and localized and involved people from 1 or 2 plantations or households rather than a wide network. If the violence took on larger proportions, then it did so by spreading in viral fashion from estate to estate, rather than as one coordinated uprising. And the goals of the rebels, as shown here in this image, were often to escape to inaccessible regions, to live outside the constraints of slavery. And that's understandable. That's achievable, rather than taking over an entire society, which seemed completely unachievable until the Haitian Revolution. This image is showing rebels defending themselves once they've run away into the inaccessible mountains of Jamaica, in this case. They were extremely effective at defending themselves here, to the point that they actually signed a treaty with the Jamaican government to be left alone, to live in peace in the mountains. Sometimes they targeted, in these uprisings, particular masters or overseers, but they did not attempt widespread racial massacre. They did not attempt a social inversion within that society. They didn't attempt political takeover. They didn't run to the political center of a colony. They ran away from it because that was safer. They ran into the mountains or the swamps or the forests, to the frontiers, to get to safety. So with this gulf between how some slaves described conspiracies and how others actually took up arms, for answers about conspiracy tropes, we have to look at the ways enslaved people deployed rumors, especially while giving this coerced testimony, and how they played on the beliefs and expectations, the world of fears that they lived in. So I want to give you a really specific example, still in New York in 1741, of how enslaved people collaborated with each other to try to navigate this really precarious moment, this really difficult moment, by using their knowledge of the world of fear. Now, there were networks that connected the Caribbean with mainland North America, and these networks were composed not just of correspondence and print material, but also of the migrations of slaves who were forced to migrate. An enslaver would say, "Hey, you're coming with me," and relocate them, or they would be sold between colonies. So for enslaved people, so that's how information could circulate between colonies for white people and enslaved people. Locally, for enslaved people, information also circulated within jails. I've found that suspects and informants actively shared information when they were waiting to be called on in the courtroom. So I'm showing you here a picture of the place that the New York City trials of 1741 occurred. You can, let's see, I think I have highlighted it. I'll show you a little bit later some of these locations where they were. So this is the courtroom up here, and the jail was down here. This is the basement. So it's all taking place in one building like that. So these jails were not effective at keeping individuals separate. Even when people weren't just crammed into a room together, instead there were flimsy walls that were keeping them apart, or gaping holes within walls. And the record is full of examples of people communicating between holes in walls, or finding that a hastily erected barrier in a giant room to subdivide it into smaller cells was so thin that people could just talk through it. And they were whispering back and forth. As people came and went from the courtroom, the others asked them for help to get their bearings when they returned to jail after they'd been in front of the judges. Having that kind of insider knowledge on the working theory of the trial was a big asset. Some discussed a need, as one jailer overheard, to speak out the same thing always and keep the same mouth. So they're saying we need to stick together in our story. Plus, the communication networks spread beyond the jail if a suspect was released into the streets of New York, would then go to a tavern, would go to a quarter and talk to people about what had happened, spreading more information about what the emerging story of the New York City conspiracy was. This information also coursed from colony to colony through the migrations of enslaved individuals, like I mentioned earlier. I want to give you the example of a man named Bill, who was convicted of a conspiracy in the Caribbean island of Antigua in 1736. When he was there, he saved himself from a death sentence by giving evidence against at least 14 men, including, as the judges later learned, an old rival for whom, as they put it, he had a great hatred. The evolution of his participation in these trials, and he did transform from a reluctant informant to a savvy one who was kind of making his way through the system. Well, after the trials, as you can imagine, Bill feared for his safety in Antigua because he had turned against many people in the community. There were something like 130 people found guilty there. And so the judges agreed to relocate him to New York. That means when New York's conspiracy scare broke out in 1741, Bill was a new arrival who had a reputation for having been involved in some plots earlier, including the Antigua plot. So Bill was arrested just on that link. He hadn't done anything. Someone just said, hey, that guy was guilty of a crime in Antigua. We should bring him in and talk to him. In jail, remember the jail is the basement of this New York City Hall. Bill drew on his Antigua experience. He volunteered information to his jailer, probably hoping that it was a demonstration of his usefulness. And so he tried to get the jailer to bring that information to the judges and show that he was willing to turn on people in the New York community to save himself again. He said that he had taken the oath of the priest, and that was playing on that fear of a Catholic agitator and organization by oath taking. And he also happened to grow close to a fellow prisoner in jail named Pedro. And he confided to Pedro that, as he put it, he understood these affairs very well. He instructed Pedro that at this point, the best way to save his life would be to confess. He said, look, mention fire, because it would, as he put it, make the judges believe him. and said to try to accuse 2 or 3 new people to demonstrate his usefulness to the investigation. And he even suggested a few names. Well, when Bill got to the courtroom upstairs, he pleaded guilty at the New York trial, and he probably hoped that he could turn King's evidence again, but this time it didn't work, and they sentenced him to burn at the stake. But even then, he still tried to save himself by naming 2 white soldiers, identifying them as secret Catholics, supposedly, who he said taught him the best way to burn down the fort and the town. He hinted that other soldiers were involved too, and he accused 9 more enslaved people while they were burning him at the stake. The only person he protected was Pedro, not realizing that Pedro was the very reason that Bill was sent to the stake. Pedro had revealed to investigators that Bill was coaching him in jail. So Pedro had taken the lesson from Bill, but turned it against him. And so Bill died at the stake. And even as he burned, he was shouting the names of 2 more enslaved people who were arrested later that night, and Bill was not saved. So slaves shared information in jail, within jail, between colonies as well, like Bill did, but so did masters. They're enslavers. In fact, investigators admitted that they were always thinking about those previous plots. One memo explicitly compared the plot at hand to others that could be, quoting here, found in story, or that were in memory or reading. These kind of received understandings handed down or handed across the between colonies were the most immediate ones, and they came through news, through printed newspapers and periodicals, sometimes in small pamphlets like these, or single sheet broadsides. I wish I had mine with me right now. I usually show my students. It's just a piece of paper. It's one sheet of paper for the most immediate, freshest news. It would sometimes be illustrated. But they also had heftier works of history that were handed down over generations. And so by the middle of the 18th century, investigators were thinking back to 50, 70 years earlier, things that were in history books. So speaking of history books, New York City's 1741 conspiracy produced its own book. The chief investigator in New York published this hefty trial record, and it was for sale in other colonies, and it circulated the very tropes that we've been talking about. It bore fruit in Jamaica just a few years later for another investigator, when the governor there scanned his copy and noticed in the appendix a man named Hanover was listed as, quote, indicted and not to be found. So Hanover had gone missing, and he had been named in the investigation in New York, but he had gone missing. And the governor said, that's funny. There's a man named Hanover here in Jamaica. And at the same time, we're going through our own conspiracy scare. Maybe this Hanover brought his experience of insurrection from New York to Jamaica and was organizing his own plot. So he arrested Hanover, and he arrested at least 12 more people who were found guilty that I found in the record. And he ordered Hanover to go back to New York, sent him back on the same ship that carried news of Jamaica's latest conspiracy scare that this governor was now investigating. And by the way, the plan in Jamaica seemed to be, you can probably guess, to set the fire in town, quote, first at one end, then at the other, so that, as they explained, when people ran in confusion to the fires, they would be stabbed and destroyed. So this trope came up again in Jamaica when the governor had this book in his hands from New York. So all this information helped enslaved people try to make their way through the proceedings. Very few came out unscathed. Well, no one came out unscathed. Very few, I should say, saved their lives once they were accused and found to be suspects deemed worth talking to. I want to put this in the perspective of how we think about slave rebellions in general to finish up. I understand the moral appeal of trying to view slave conspiracies as forms of collective resistance that were rebellions. But and I'm not saying that rebellions didn't occur. They certainly did. There were moments when people took up arms against their enslavers. But if we mix up conspiracies with rebellions and say they're all the same thing, and we mix up fear with resistance, we end up overstating this particular possibility of slaves' politics. And if we overstate this version of politics, this violent collective version, then that distorts our understanding of other political lives of enslaved people. Rebellion was only one of many possible human responses. While no one wished to be enslaved, the overwhelming majority of people appear to have calculated the personal cost of insurrection and its improbability of success. So instead, they pursued day-to-day individual resistance that historians have been writing about as being secure in its anonymity, using what historians have called weapons of the weak. This is not as flashy as a rebellion or an insurrection, but it was more human scale, more meaningful to individuals who were trying to protect themselves. A rebellion was practically suicidal to attempt. We don't need to give up entirely looking for collective politics, because if we look carefully at these conspiracy records and read them, what historians would say, against the grain. So read them against the purpose for which they were written. Just read between the lines. We find some mundane political activities that enslavers failed to notice, but which probably held really great meaning for the forced migrants and exploited individuals that were being documented. I'm showing you here another image of community or social life among enslaved people. This one is from South Carolina around the year 1800. This is thought to be showing either a dance or a wedding. You can see one of the earliest depictions of a banjo in America right there. People were keenly aware of the vulnerability of being alone when they were enslaved. So I would say that a vital form of their collective politics was to create these new groups of belonging. In these records, I find lots of evidence of extensive sociability across plantations and household lines. In fact, that sociability was the key basis for masters' fears of networked plotting. So because people gathered as a form of quiet politics, to borrow a word from a dissertation student of mine here at FAU, he talks about quiet resistance. This kind of quiet politicking that's going on day to day escaped the notice of masters until there was a conspiracy scare. And then informants used it to make their accusations. There were families also to bridge these artificial divides that masters were putting up between them, the plantation lines. And there were informal networks of acquaintance. They ate together, they drank together, they danced, and they threw dice together. They also stole from each other. I'm not saying this was a utopia. They coveted each other's spouses, we see in the record, and so they that turns up sometimes in the testimony. They had long feuds sometimes. This could lead to personal violence, and in the case of conspiracy scares, to some motives for accusing each other in front of the investigators. So if we're thinking about the different practices of politics besides insurrection, we could also look at these records for evidence of patron-client relationships. So that's evidence of a head honcho, someone very powerful in the community who has dependents beneath him or clients, people who benefit from his gifts and his largesse, and in return promise their loyalty. This was an important feature of enslaved communities, even though they've largely escaped the notice of American historians today. This form of political organization was similar to some stuff that was happening in West Africa and West Central Africa, where enslaved people originated from, where a leader would give out gifts of cloth or other prestige items coming through the foreign trade, and use that to make a claim on someone's allegiance. And the allegiance of people was very, very highly valued. In fact, more valued than the control of land in Africa. They wanted to control people in West Africa. In the greater Caribbean and in the colonies that became the US, there's evidence of similar activity, that enslaved men of higher status distributed small gifts of cloth and food to their supporters. As one patron put it to a potential recruit that I found in the record, if you was to see me do good, you would do good. If I do bad, you do bad. So this is kind of corporate unit in which everyone's fates are tied together, and there's a leader who gives their largesse to others, as meager as it might be. And as one of the associates of this guy put it in another situation, if you would take part with Court, which was the name of this patron, if you would take part with this patron, he would make you a very great man. That's how politics worked in Africa, and it was coming over to America. Also, women were important connectors in these networks. When a man wished to host a supper to have people over for like a patron treating their clients, a woman would host it. Other times it was just a social occasion. And I keep saying a woman would host it rather than the family would, because remember, enslaved people couldn't control where they lived. So there were many marriages that crossed plantation lines. A wife lived on a different plantation than a husband, and the wife would be the one to host whatever the husband wanted to put on. So these gatherings bridged households and plantations, and people created new identities as a result. And they created social structures that could shelter individuals and offer communal responses, and also some resources to people who were otherwise unprotected because they were forced migrants. So that's another place that these conspiracy scares could encourage us to look for politics. It's less flashy, it's certainly less violent, at least if we're thinking of violence committed by enslaved people. It was very violent always, from the perspective of the enslavers. They were always torturing people just to get work out of them. And it's a different way to think about politics that I think is more honest. Conspiracy scares, so that's some of the implications for thinking of rebellion, but we can also think about racism here. Conspiracy scares were kind of a symptom of the instability of life in America, an instability that was especially inflamed by slavery itself, because there was so much coercion going on. And these conspiracy scares were kind of a glue that could hold that society together. So it's an unstable society, and fear becomes a binding agent for white people. Settlers who were coming from diverse places in Europe could coalesce around a white identity, a single identity that they didn't hold until they were in the context of American slavery. So one of the implications of my research is that these expectations of violence, these fears about violence, were a basis for many settlers to consider themselves white and to organize their societies along racial terms. That was a new thing in the 17th and 18th centuries. Whiteness, the idea of people identifying themselves as white, did not exist yet before the 17th century. This was part of how that happened. The fears about violence lent themselves to abstractions about race, like race. A colonist at the time noticed a large number of conspiracy scares in all this reading he was doing, and wrote about them as an ongoing struggle of, as he put it, the Negroes against the Europeans. Using these collective identities, these nouns of collective racial identity, and saying it is this group against that group. And what's more, it wasn't just categorical thinking, but it was racial thinking. When an investigator in New York used this kind of imagined violence to declare that plotters were the beasts of the people, as he put it, who were degenerated below the dignity of human species. So by fearing violence from a collective group and then using that fear to dehumanize them, white people were imagining Black people in collective terms that deeply racialized society. So fear was holding white people together as a glue. And it was also a belief system with the strong emotional ballast that made it appear that Black men would be supposedly automatically violent, or that white women were imminently about to be victimized, about to be raped by Black men. These are myths that were perpetuated by these investigations I've been telling you about. And fear of the collapse of social hierarchy also was a part of this. White identities coalesced around feeling like victims, as other historians have been finding, that this is a part of how the white identity emerged in society through a sense of victimhood. And in this case, we're talking about kind of a predicted victimhood conjured by these cataclysmic fears. This is what underwrote a new racial regime that provided its own form of stability for white people, and as I think I've shown you amply here, um, encouraged more instability among Black people who were enslaved. So I'm going to leave it there now, and I would be glad to take any questions that you may have submitted to the system here, the Q&A system.
Thank you, Jason. And just as a reminder, as our speaker was saying, if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A button. We'll go through as many questions as we can, and if there should be any left by the time we're out of time, we will ask Dr. Sharples to answer them offline and post them on our website. Okay, so Jason, you mentioned that these conspiracy theories came about in the 16th century. Was there a particular event that started them, or just with the start of slavery, it automatically began that the white population, as you said, created this need to feel this togetherness?
Well, I'm going to share my screen again to show you where this came from. Slideshow, play from current slide. There we go. Resume share. You should be seeing something that looks a bit like a cartoon. Let me try that again. So this has many of the elements of the tropes that I was telling you about. The fire in town as a decoy fire. Also, in different places, there is the rape of white women, the overturn of society in which the conspirators are taking the identities of the leader. But you might see in small writing up here, it says, scheme of popish cruelties up here. And that's because Catholic plotting was a longer tradition in England, and it went to the colonies. Colonists were afraid that Catholics, who were, we would call them white today, Catholics were plotting to take over the Protestant society. And that set of ideas, combined with the kind of the growing numbers of enslaved people in the colonies that were accelerating in the 17th century, to the point that, and those two things got married together. So it's kind of a combination of a longer cause was fear of Catholics, and the immediate cause in the 17th century, the event, you might say, was a much larger population very rapidly entering the colonies from Africa.
Mm-hmm. So one of our attendees noted that in the 20th century, exactly 1914, a Dominican servant locked all but one door to the house of Frank Lloyd Wright and set a fire to a party and then shot everybody who ran out individually. Wow. And Wright wasn't there, but his wife died in the attack. And so were these trope of burnings and murder still alive in the last century?
I have heard from people that they grew up with these fears themselves, people who lived in the Deep South in the middle of the 20th century. My research does not extend to the 20th century, so I haven't seen the documentary examples, but I've heard from people about this. And and so fire is what historians call a weapon of the weak, because it can be anonymous if you want it to be. and it is accessible to almost anyone, right? It's turning a tool, something familiar and necessary, into a weapon against someone. So that's why there are fears possibly still circulating in this way. Yeah, so certainly the rape of white women by Black men was a current one in the 20th century. Certainly, you could consider the way some they're called uprisings, or protests that involve a lot of collective action in the streets, get portrayed by the media as more violent than they really are. Might be seen as a continuation of this kind of tendency of the powers that be seeing political political opponents in this way.
Another question from one of our attendees is, did Martin Delaney's Blake, The Huts of America, enter the general slave rebellion conversation? That would require you to know this book.
So Martin Delaney's, could you repeat the rest?
Blake, The Huts of America, enter the general slave rebellion conversation?
So that would have been, I think, near the tail end of the period that I'm studying, but I'm not familiar with this. It must be a work of writing. Is that right?
I assume so. I don't know it either.
Okay. I'll have to look this up then.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Do your historical findings have any implications for contemporary U.S. criminal justice? You led on a little bit to that, right? So the contemporary U.S. criminal justice practices and policy.
Yeah. Well, historians have already found that the institutional roots of some police forces go back to slave patrols, that those were the first policing forces in America. And they were created for white people to control Black people. And that's not the mission that we give them today, but institutionally speaking, there's a bit of a lineage there. And so in that respect, institutionally, yes, there is a direct link. And if you're thinking about the way fear can put blinders on people and make them make rash decisions that are violent, that produce violent consequences, I think we see that playing out still. I think the question in society today is, seems to be, whose fear are we going to take seriously? Because everyone is claiming fear. Many Black Americans are telling us that they've been terrorized. They feel terrorized. They feel fear. And that's what protests are about in Black Lives Matter, national consciousness. At the time, many law enforcement officers are saying, we're afraid when we go out into the to do our jobs. And the difference is that we've seen juries until recently generally side with the law enforcement officer's view and take that fear more seriously than a Black person on the street who's being stalked. And also it's who has authorization to use a weapon. That's the other thing. So I think fear is very much a part of that calculation today. And we may not talk about it like that, but a lot of the incidents, the shootings that we're talking about are rooted in fear that comes from maybe a general inherited view of the world that we have, that maybe certain segments of the population supposedly are more dangerous than others, although that wouldn't be true.
And we may not even recognize that it's fear that is driving certain actions, right?
Yeah.
Okay, a really good question, I think, is what about depression? You mentioned that a lot of the slaves were kind of pursued almost, right? And then they were tortured and made to confess to whatever. What about depression? And did the enslaved people commit suicide in great numbers? Do you have any knowledge of that?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. And historians of slavery have been among the leaders in thinking about trauma as something worthy of historical study. And it's really hard to document these things, but if you're asking about people completing suicide, then yes, it did occur in higher numbers. That is something documentable. It happened as early as the Middle Passage, when people were first enslaved in Africa and got on the ships, were forced on the ships to go to America. The only route of escape essentially was to throw themselves overboard or to kill themselves some other way, because it was such an experience of torture on that ship. And because they didn't know what fate was awaiting them. There was also, it may not just be depression, because there was a belief system in the part of Africa that's present day Nigeria, that people, once they died, would go back to their homeland, that they would fly home, as it was, as they put it. Not everyone believed this, but some historians do suggest that that's a reason for higher incidence of suicide. But that's not for everyone. And so, yeah, there were these ramifications for the entire community after these events. There were psychological ramifications.
Great. Okay, we're about out of time. I know we have a few more questions here. We will ask Dr. Sharples to answer those offline, and we'll put the answers together with a recording of today's presentation on our website. We apologize, there were a few glitches with the audio. You know, the Wi-Fi is not always perfect, but hopefully you were able to understand everything. So thank you very much, Dr. Sharples. And again, we will put the recording and answers to the remaining questions on our website. Thanks again. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.